Don't you just hate when a game thinks you're an idiot? I can't stand when a game treats me like a child and holds my hand through tutorial levels and the early portions of the story. Sometimes, entries in a long-running series can insult your intelligence with how they approach the opening hour or so. But what does it really mean for a game to respect your intelligence? It's when a game can rely on you to not be lost as it throws things at you, and it's when it doesn't babysit you through the early portions of a game. Instead, letting you freely interact with game mechanics because it trusts you to use them effectively. We trust Persona games with hundreds of hours of our time. Do the games trust you to not be stupid in return? I want to evaluate each modern Persona game based on a few criteria. First, how long does it take to get to the Velvet Room? This is obviously important since the Velvet Room is the catalyst to the wider plot in the Persona games, and typically this is where you get at least some kind of lore dump. Next is evaluating how long it takes until the main plot is revealed. You might get some thoughts here and there, but when is it revealed what your actual day-to-day leads up to? Another element I'm going to be looking at is perhaps the most objective measure. On which day does a standard gameplay loop begin where you're free to make your own choices? Finally, what information is explicitly stated versus what information is shown? It's typically accepted that showing is preferred over telling in visual media, and I think that's a critical evaluation of whether or not a game respects your intelligence. This is an exact science, so if you're a fan of this analysis, please consider subscribing for more content, especially Persona and other JRPGs moving forward. There's no deep life lesson here, except for this: get to the point. There's value in that. Let's take a trip. Persona 3 has a reputation for being the game that's the slowest to get going. Fans typically complain that the early part of the game is a slow burn as the game cycles through a Monster of the Month format. Essentially, you're trying to fill up your time with things to do while you wait for the plot to progress every full moon. Personally, the complaint that Persona 3 starts slow is a complaint that I agreed with when I first played Persona 3 Reload. Persona 3 was my second Persona game ever after Persona 4 Golden. But today, I'm here to look at things objectively. More or less. This may be controversial, but the original Persona 3 has the best opening scene. Reload kind of waters it down a bit by adding dialogue, whereas the original really captures an atmosphere that's so bleak and dreary with no words spoken.
There's no way, I can't!
Yukari Takaba holding the evoker, which is not a gun, to her head is especially poignant when we don't know that it's not a gun. What Reload does well though, is that it actually is more immersive to control the character past all of the Dark Hour coffins, while the protagonist, canonically named Makoto Yuki, doesn't do much to acknowledge the bizarreness of his surroundings. Just aura farming like crazy. Upon reaching the dorm where he'll be staying for the next year, Makoto is greeted by Pharaoh. He's then confronted by Yukari, holding the same gun that she was in the opening sequence, and the protagonist just takes it in stride, before peace is mediated by Mitsuru Kirijo. Despite a very effective opening, the game does slow down a little bit with a couple of school days as you await the next full moon. You finally make it to the Velvet Room on the third day of the game after your second day of school. Igor's monologue is pretty vague, but he does make reference to the contract that you signed with Pharos earlier. Getting the Velvet Key on April 8th is a key benchmark that we'll take note of. On April 9th, you go to school as usual, but as it's a full moon again,
Crazy how time flies.
shadows attack the dorm. Makoto awakens to his persona with the iconic and now things are really cooking. Reload again opts to use its in-game visual system to tell the story instead of an anime cutscene, which is a choice that not everyone will agree with. One thing's for sure, the scene is extremely green. After the Orpheus/Thanatos persona defeats the full moon boss, we get another Velvet Room scene and a brief time skip that takes you from April 9th to April 17th. This could hurt the objective rankings of how long it takes to open up into regular gameplay, but subjectively, this doesn't really matter because you didn't have to experience that missing week anyway. The next day, you go through school again, but you're locked into walking home with Yukari, and you finally get an exposition dump, a brief one, as Shuji Ikutsuki, Akihiko Sanada, Mitsuru, and Yukari meet with you in a group, and they finally tell you more details of what's going on. If you're keeping track at home, it takes 11 calendar days to get most of the context you'll need to start the game. Conveniently, you sleep all day through the 18th into the evening of the 19th after a cutscene with Pharaohs, and that takes you to Junpei Iori's introduction to the team. Finally, on April 20th, the main point of the game is revealed. Run around Tartarus until they can somehow get rid of the Dark Hour. It's very complicated stuff. It's also right after this exposition dump that you're able to enter into Tartarus for the first time. Tartarus is the main dungeon of the game, and it's where you're going to be spending your time in between full moon bosses, scaling up countless floors until you get to the top. However, you still aren't able to enter the standard gameplay loop. That doesn't occur until the next day, April 21st, where you get full freedom of how to spend your time. The game starts on April 6th, but it doesn't really open up for the first 15 in-game days. Can we confidently say that Persona 3 respects your intelligence? When it comes to factors such as revealing the main plot and how long it takes to enter into the standard gameplay loop, it definitely drags its feet getting you going. How long it takes to get you into the Velvet Room and whether it shows or tells more are definitely measurements that go in P3's favor. On that last point though, the original Persona 3 does an even better job than Reload. Overall, I was surprised when doing research for this game how much I was engaged going through this portion of the story again, compared to how I remembered it. In total, it took me 3 hours and 16 minutes to get to the first moment of gameplay freedom. So that adds a little context as to why we can give a favorable rating as far as when the gameplay loop starts. If you're keeping track at home, I'm going to flash the stats onto the screen right now. The problem with the rest of Persona 3's early game is that not much happens in between each full moon as you work toward the ambiguous goal of eliminating the Dark Hour, despite not knowing exactly how to do that. But that's a topic for another video. On to the GOAT. Full disclosure, it's hard to be objective with Persona 4. It was my first Persona experience, and I'm trying to let enough time go by before I definitively declare it to be my favorite game of all time. But how does it hold up when it comes to the criteria that I set out? Immediately after you confirm your settings for the game, Persona 4 drops you right into the Velvet Room. That's a big plus for our criteria, and it's the fastest that any of the games get you in there. In the Velvet Room, you meet Igor and his attendant Margaret. For some, this may not be the strongest opening, but when it comes to getting you started with the plot and setting the stage for future developments, it does launch you right into the thick of things, confusing or not. From then on, it does take a little time to get things going. On a replay, the game wins back some points on the show don't tell category by showing news reports that set the stage of some of the main plot threads. If you're not paying attention, it's easy to completely miss references to what's going on with Mayumi Yamano, Misuzu Hiragi, and Taro Namatame, which is basically the catalyst for the whole plot. It also does a good job of showing you the very basic skeleton of the protagonist, Yu Narukami's background, and why he's on the train heading to Inaba. The game keeps up intrigue by flashing toward the murder scenes, but for the most part, it keeps things lighthearted. The first day of Inaba is officially April 11th. At the train station, you bump into Marie, which is a golden exclusive character, and that gives you just a handful of points for foreshadowing. What's funny though is that Marie doesn't have a car, you're going completely opposite directions, but somehow she beats you to the shopping district. It's pretty funny when you think about it. Additionally, at the gas station on that first day, you run into the gas station attendant. Without going deeply into spoiler territory, that's a plot point that occurs very early on in the game that doesn't really pay off until you get the golden ending and check all the boxes. It's very easy to miss what you need to do to get that final ending and to fully understand the mystery of the Midnight Channel. So leaving a breadcrumb that early is respectable. When you go to sleep that night, you get your first taste of gameplay in a dream sequence, which also helps to break up the pacing a bit. On April 12th, you attend your first day of school, and you're introduced to Chie Satonaka and Yukiko Amagi, and also Yosuke's bike. After school, you get your first exposure to the full plot. There's a murder scene that the characters pass by on their way home. More background information is given through the news report on the TV, so in case you missed some of the info mentioned in the opening scenes, you can catch up here. Even after the first day of school mentions a murder, it doesn't have a direct effect on the protagonist. The following day on April 13th, the Midnight Channel is directly mentioned, and that's the biggest enduring plot point that we've directly discussed so far. You finally get to enter the TV world and learn more about the threat that you face 3 days into the game on April 14th, but you still don't get into gameplay. It's not until Saki Kanishi is discovered dead that the game brings you back into the TV world on April 15th, where you finally get to unlock your first persona, Izanagi, and the first real fight of the game occurs. So officially, you have 4 days to get into real combat, not the fake tutorial stuff from the first night. You fight your first boss battle on the same day when Shadow Yosuke appears, but even after that, you don't get to open up into the standard gameplay loop. On April 17th, you're locked into trying to rescue Chie after she bursts into the TV world to try to save Yukiko, who's gone missing. While you aren't able to save Yukiko just yet, you do confront Chie's shadow in a boss battle that's a little tricky. However, the game does a good job of making sure you know how to approach it. Once Chie's persona has awakened, the team is set. You, Yosuke, and Chie, with Teddy offering support. Finally, on April 18th, you're free to go. The game explains how you can use your time, and you have 2 weeks to free Yukiko from her dungeon before the April 29th deadline. On top of the objective ways the game gets you to this point, Persona 4 does a good job at telling instead of showing. The exposition of the Midnight Channel is very obviously exposition-y, but that's a commonality between all three of the games we're going to look at today. Flashing relevant plot points in the intro scenes quickly on screen keeps up intrigue, and it does a great job of setting the stage as you try to put the pieces together. It's fitting because the whole game has you essentially doing the same to solve a murder. It took me about 3 hours and 51 minutes and 7 in-game days to get to the first moment of gameplay freedom. If you're keeping track at home, here are the stats. Overall, Persona 4 Golden's early game pacing isn't revolutionary, and it's definitely not as fast as I remember, but we'll see where it lands at the end of this video. The last entry we're going to look at today is the newest mainline Persona entry, Persona 5. Persona 5 is interesting because it actually combines quite a few elements of the 2 previous games in terms of how they start. However, Persona 5 bucks the trend of the previous 2 games by starting in media res, meaning in the middle of the game. You start immediately with a gameplay section that teaches you the basics of traversal and combat systems, before flashing it back to the beginning of the game in April. Throughout the story, you keep flashing forward to the protagonist speaking to the police after getting caught in this opening sequence. In some ways, it adds a lot of tension with the back and forth between the timeline. As you go through each section of the story, you're wondering when you're going to get to the point where the flash forward occurs. But in other ways, it does cut some narrative tension because you figure that all things are going to work out, at least until you get to that point. But there are enough twists and turns on the way to block out the cons. The game opens with a monologue from Igor, and then drops you in media res in the casino level. After completing the opening section with some help from Kasumi, the main character gets caught and interrogated, flashing you back to the beginning of the events that kick off the story. We see our main character, canonically referred to as Ren Amamiya, arriving in Shibuya, where the Metaverse app appears on his phone. After a brief cutscene and some foreshadowing of his starter persona, Arsene, you gain control of Ren on April 9th, the first day of the game, just like Persona 3. You navigate the subway, probably getting lost along the way just like you would in real-life Tokyo, and eventually make your way to your new home in Yongen-jaya. After being rudely welcomed by Sojiro Sakura, the sun sets on your first day. What follows is a dream sequence that explains how the main character became a felon at his young age while trying to be a hero. After that, still on the very first night, we awaken in the Velvet Room on April 9th. This borrows from Persona 4's playbook of early access to the Velvet Room, as well as a bit more mysterious exposition to help you get situated. The following day is kind of a nothing day in regards to this video. You watch a bunch of cutscenes that set the stage for the main narrative, including some of the big players, the mental shutdowns, and the impact that has on society, as well as the game's first villain. On April 11th, it's your first day of school, and you take the long road there before a couple of cutscenes, including one that hints at the real relationship between a main character, how'd you know, An Takamaki, and the first villain, Suguru Kamoshida. You move into a cutscene where our main character, as well as another passerby, Ryuji Sakamoto, enter into the metaverse, which gives us access to our first dungeon area. However, we don't have access to roam around freely yet. While we're still on April 11th, our two main characters are held captive in the dungeon of Kamoshida's palace, and this is where we get our earliest official Persona awakening of the series, on the first day of school and the third day of the game. The characters are able to break out of the palace following Ren awakening his Persona powers with Arsene, and then you run into Morgana, who is really helpful when it comes to explaining some of the lore behind the metaverse, palaces, and personas in general. Unlike the other games, this doesn't feel as necessary because we haven't spent that much time being confused. In that sense, it's good that it happens at this point, because too soon is probably preferable to too late when it comes to clarity regarding the plot. After escaping the palace, the characters get in trouble at school and finish the day. That evening, we get more Velvet Room time, and I think this is more effective than delaying our entry into the Velvet Room or going in too early and letting a while go by before it becomes relevant again. With small doses at the end of each day, we're being drip-fed information at a steady rate. However, it is a lot of text to wade through. April 12th begins with some Persona 5 Royal exclusive content, giving us our introduction to Kasumi Yoshizawa. You make your way through the day and even more cutscenes before Ren and Ryuji try to discover a way back to Kamoshida's palace. As you progress through the palace, you get more gameplay elements explained to you for you to put into practice. You memorize some faces that you wish to interrogate the next day. You get caught by Kamoshida's forces, and Ryuji awakens to his persona. But then after that, and another Velvet Room cutscene, we're on to April 13th. April 13th begins, but our protagonists don't have much success doing a real-world investigation into Kamoshida's allegations. And that's the end of that day. Not much happened besides reading through a bunch of texts and wandering around the school. This is the continuation of what I'd say is a troubling sign for this game. On April 14th, Morgana makes his way to the real world, and our main objective comes into place. Defeat Kamoshida in the metaverse, and he'll confess to his crimes himself, since no one being abused by him wants to confess. After school, Ren confronts An Takamaki after she has a loud disagreement with Kamoshida on the phone, and her status as a victim clearly comes into focus. The plot really takes off on April 15th, when one of Kamoshida's victims jumps off the roof in an attempt at self-harm. Ryuji, Ren, and another whistleblower, Mishima, face expulsion after confronting him, and they steal their resolve to change his heart in the palace. Watching her friend Shiho crumble under Kamoshida's abuse motivates An to follow our heroes into Kamoshida's palace, and she awakens to her own persona. The initial team is now set: Morgana, An, Ryuji, and Ren. We're on the cusp of freedom from the tech simulator, but we're not quite there yet. The following day on April 16th, you get to meet the doctor at the clinic, Tae Takami, in order to gain access to medicine for dungeon runs. The next day doesn't allow you any agency either, as you make a trip to Shibuya to pick up model guns at Iwai's shop with Ryuji. Finally, on April 18th, you get the long-awaited mission start message on the chalkboard that signifies that you are free to use your time as you please, as long as you steal Kamoshida's heart before May 2nd to avoid expulsion. It took me exactly 5 hours to get to this point. Looking back at our criteria, we gain access to the Velvet Room on April 9th. The team resolves to change Kamoshida's heart on April 15th, and the standard gameplay loop begins on April 18th. It takes 9 in-game days, but being completely honest, there are a lot of cutscenes and conversations to get through, and it feels like it drags on as long as it does. As far as show don't tell goes, there's a ton of dialogue, but I don't feel like a lot of that dialogue is exposition. There are a lot of character interactions, which help us get more attached to the different parties in the game. Here's the final breakdown on the screen. Persona 5 fights the directionlessness of early Persona 3 with its opening flash-forward segment, and this helps with our perception of pacing, because at least you're working towards something. However, objectively, it is a lot of text and background information to get through. And to be completely fair to the other two games, you don't really get the full main plot revealed with the determination to change Kamoshida's heart. It's only after they successfully change his heart that they resolve to continue rebelling against corrupt adults, and the rest of the game's plot continues to unfold. I'm not going to be too harsh here, but in some ways, that lines more closely with what people criticize Persona 3 for. Persona 5 just does it better. Now that we have the final rankings for Persona 5, it's time to see how all three stack up against each other. The results, according to our very scientific and extremely meticulous criteria, will be determined on a point system. For a green checkmark emoji, the game will get 2 points. For a yellow warning sign, 1 point. For a red X, 0 points. When you tally everything up, here's how it shakes out. In a tie for second place, we have Persona 5 and Persona 3, each with 3 points. This leaves our number 1 spot for Persona 4. Yes, I know I'm biased. So I did try to add some objectivity. Subjectively, here's how the 3 games shake out for me. Persona 3 was better than I expected on a replay, and it ended up having the technically shortest runtime, though some of that shortage may have come from using a New Game Plus save file. A lot of its pacing issues come with how the plot is set up at large after the opening, but the intro is pretty good. Unfortunately, you do waste quite a few days even without the week time skip, and there's also a lot of exposition dumped all at once. Persona 4 starts a bit more directionless, ironically, but the central plot is revealed early enough, and that plot adds meaning to your patience. By having that in the back of your mind following the Yamano and Konishi murders, all interactions afterward have that backdrop working in the game's favor. What's shown versus told really demonstrates respect for how you can piece information together. Persona 5 should be the best, but there's just so much to get through. While there is a central plot, it doesn't clearly reveal itself, and instead it opts to be a shade closer to Persona 3's plot structure at first, even with its effective in medias res start. Again, what does it really mean for a game to not think you're an idiot? Persona 4 trusts you enough to get to the point right away, and to get started interacting with its mechanics. That's Persona 4, but what's great is that none of the games are bad at it, so you can't go wrong with this franchise. At least in modern games. But what do you think? Do you agree that Persona 4 respects your intelligence the most, or is it the more popular Persona 5? Maybe you're a Persona 3 truther. Or maybe you're angrily typing a comment about how I left out Persona 1 or the Persona 2 duology, even though the calendar mechanics that are absent in those games wouldn't fit the criteria I said. Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, and you enjoy playing games that don't treat you like an idiot, please consider subscribing. More is on the way.
See ya!